Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our LGFA match official webinar tonight. First of all, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. I have with me tonight Joe Turley from Performa Sports. Joe is going to take the lead on the webinar tonight. My own name is Lizzie Flynn. I work with the LGFA in player and referee education. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I suppose the webinar tonight will be approximately 60 to 70 minutes, and that'll also depend maybe also on the number of questions and the chat that comes in from yourselves. If you want to ask any questions during the presentation, we'll give you lots of opportunity, so you can put it into the chat box or even the Q&A. So I'll monitor the Q&A function there. So if anyone that I know there, I think Jackie might be on there. If Jackie or any of the lads want to come in there, maybe just test that for me to make sure it's working, that would be great. But I'll pick up all the questions ideally in the Q&A. So just before I pass over to Joe, I'd like to encourage you to ask as many questions as possible, or if there's something not sure on, or even something that surprises you, something you've learned tonight, maybe you never thought of before, we'd ask you to share that. So I can see the Q&A is working there, which is fantastic. Thank you, Jackie, very much. Okay, I'll pass over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Lizzie, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and thanks to the LGFA for the opportunity to share some of the work we've been doing behind the scenes, just looking at this area of referee analysis, a little bit about maybe what it means, what the project entails, and we're learning as the process is developing as well. So some of the lessons that we've learned, or at least some of the information starting to present, was sort of given it the theme of supporting the playmakers, because as you know, our games, the critical parts of our game that make it possible are, in addition to the volunteers and the clubs right through to county, it's the people, so the players, the coaches. But without the game or without the game referees, the game itself doesn't happen. So they have a big responsibility, and it's not an easy thing to do. And there's different contexts, different situations to weigh up and deal with as well. So it's important to have a process shaped around helping them. So this is really about education. And you'll probably hear me mention the term reflection a couple of times as we go through. Just we all can benefit from being able to look back and see what we've done, and actually have the help of peer groups and others that we work with as well. So a little bit about the project and what we're going to run through tonight. Initially, just the overview, how it's structured, maybe what it looks like, because it's a wee bit different than other types of analysis. We're actually looking at the official and the support around that official in a game. Some of the findings we've found so far, and some of the suggestions and highlights it's steering us towards. And then there's a summary at the end, a couple of key takeaways. As I mentioned, there's more for us to develop and learn through this, but there's been quite a lot of detail that's been processed so far. So where this came about is we've teamed up with the LGFA to look at really refereeing actions and events. So these would be influenced by the game and the situations the referee finds him or herself in. Some of these may be obvious enough, particularly if you're refereeing or having watched games. The added dimension that we layered on top was to look at behavioral analysis as well. So this is something that has been well researched and developed in other areas of sport and education, probably more obvious within coaching context, but also has an application in this situation as well. So we're looking at two levels. So we're looking at game events that the referee is performing in the contest itself, but also how the referee behaves and interacts in those situations. And we've sort of broadened out the term game to be the game day, because there's different stages to the game. So we'll be familiar with gameplay in first half and second half. There'll be things that happen during those competitive periods, but there's also an initial period, there's a halftime break, and then there's a conclusion at the end. And there's different things that can happen, and different things that could influence things that occur in the game as well. How we went about creating a structure, because there's a lot that can happen and a lot to look for. So to give us a bit of a structure, an architecture to work from, we based a lot of our approach on proven academic research and models, both around behavioral analysis and also around the game itself and the structure, and with the support of the LGFA to look at what those structures are in terms of the guidelines, the rules and the governance, etc. So it's a combination of those that we split into two parts. So there's two sides of the analysis. When we go to a game, typically what it looks like is 2 camera angles, because there is a lot going on. So what we do is we set up what we call a ref cam. So that would be pitch side with height, but we also have that linked to an audio mic. So the referees are mic'd up, so we get a live feed of audio, so we can hear discussion and chat. It's got a good range, even from what that one person's standing. We can also hear what players say. We can hear abstracts of conversation with others, including maybe a team official, match officials, etc. So we have a good feed of information. The reason we put a second camera behind the goal was to give us a bit of a broader reach of view, like a second set of eyes, because it could be something that happens on the far side of the play of the field, which may be slightly out of scope of where we're positioned initially. So what we find is using both together gives us a much rounder picture. And as I mentioned, we've broadened the game base out a little bit more, because in the pre-match stage, there's things like warm-up, there's interaction with people, there's questions happen, there's interaction with different members of different teams, even before the game starts itself, and then eventually reaches its conclusion. So that's given us a framework to ground how we view the game in terms of time and stages, but then also how we capture the information that we then process for analysis. So we break it down in terms of data. The 2 parts, as I mentioned earlier, the game events themselves. So in play, we're looking at the governance of the game and allowing the game to flow against the rules of the game. We're also tracking the positioning for the referee for key events and restarts. So these are things that we would expect to happen. The concession of a score, a restart, a free, etc. There are set parts of the game that will occur, and we're looking for the referee's position in relation to those. So common things and also to look at the position of the referee. And then just things that the referee may choose to apply given the situation that he or she sees, and how her judgment or his or her judgment applies to that. So things like advantage, if they have to stop the play, if they have to intervene with a caution, things like that. And then the behavioral bit, we looked at the type of behavior and the content. So what type of message was included in that behavior, albeit maybe instruction or questioning. Who received the information, and maybe when it happened. And again, that was mapped against how we looked at the overall timeline of a game day, as opposed to just the game itself. Types of content included instruction. We looked at tone of voice around verbal communication, and modeling. So for example, modeling would be a visual display to explain what that thing is that they've called. So for example, it could have been the referee may have blown a whistle for a foul. The foul that he or she may have seen could have been a tug of a jersey. So modeling in that example might be that the referee pulls the back of his or her own jersey. So that's a display to replicate what he or she had seen. So that would be modeling the foul as a foul simulation. So it means that those watching around can see a picture of why that foul was awarded or why the whistle was blown at that occasion. The types of content would be mainly looking at technical points and non-technical. So technical points might be a query over an aspect of the game. Sometimes you would have heard maybe a player ask for clarity on their view or the referee's view on maybe the distance for kick out, the positioning for kick outs. You may also hear non-technical questions and discussions around the game. If you're refereeing, you know yourself, you'll always get approached and get asked questions that may start with how many ticks there are, or confirming what players are on a certain number of ticks, but then it can develop into a totally different conversation. And that might be a lead in to different things in terms of engagement, and maybe what those types of people are trying to get back as well. The season itself.
Joe, do you mind if I just jump in there, because it's a really, really interesting point that maybe I suppose is that sometimes when we train referees, I suppose do the referees themselves, or do you get feedback in terms of their experience of actually that interaction, particularly with people? I suppose maybe mentors or managers coming with asking those questions, or was there any sort of feedback around that?
There was some from individuals, but not from the group. I think that's a point that was really good to develop. What I observed would have been that referees with a little bit more life experience, who had been around the block to a certain extent, knew that certain conversations could lead to a setup, or certain conversations may have led to something else. So they were prepared for it. Whereas others maybe new, because you have to understand the referees we worked with here, some were very new to refereeing and just starting the refereeing journey. Some were highly experienced. So it was a complete range, and that spectrum was actually good to have across the group. And they all had their own personality. Some were really confident and outgoing, some were a bit more retired, or maybe more disciplined in certain areas. But it's and then I suppose part of it is, who is the other person? So if you imagine a renowned or say a famous coach of a team stepping in, what impact does that have versus someone else? So these are all things that can affect the game or the environment, but they're not the game itself. If that makes sense. So there's things to be aware of.
Because I think from a referee's point of view, there's a real learning that comes from that, and that comes with experience as well. But the importance as well, I suppose, at those intervals at half time, I suppose the water breaks are gone now, but at half time, the importance of that team of officials. And while you're not necessarily maybe looking at that, Joe, but I think as referees and match officials that are on tonight, that that we're not isolating a referee, or particularly if we have more experienced match officials on the day around them. So I suppose for me, that's a really key point, that that comes with experience, but where there's people appointed to line or whatnot in games at club level or provincial level or national level, that that we're a whole team, because that's for somebody starting out, that can be very daunting, I think, Joe. So it's just really, really interesting as well. So I just want to bring that up. Thank you. Now, just I want to note there's one or two hands that went up there, so but I just encourage you again, if you have a question or you want to pop something, put it into the Q&A, or even pop it into the chat and I'll pick that up. Thanks very much. Back to you again, Joe. Thank you.
No worries. No, there are really good points. I mean, you can imagine no one wants to be isolated in any role, in any manner of life, I suppose, but in a game, it's really important to have that support network. We did look, I'll mention a wee bit as we go along, where you could see where the match officials and that trust and that support was really important. Even if you wanted to question something again, reflection in action. In this example, might be to go into another match official who's a better view of the situation you're in, or to confirm a judgment before you apply it. That these are mature things to do. It doesn't show any indecisiveness. It's still a referee in this situation in control, but actually pulling in the facts before they make the final judgment, because this could be a major call, like a penalty, like a card that's issued, and those calls could potentially have an impact on the result of the game. You have two teams that are in contest with each other. So in terms of the overall scope that we went through, we've actually just completed our second season. So we've 2 years basis of data, and in total 58 games, and it's a mix of championship and league across two sets of 23 referees. So that meant that some referees we got to observe multiple times. Some was a one-off, and it's just it's a progress as we work our way through. So the importance of maybe the game types would have been maybe the significance, a league game versus maybe a critical championship game, where both the result will matter, but maybe in championship, particularly when you're reaching knockout stages, it's the critical element of as well. And that's maybe that contextual point of the situation of the game itself, and what level players and coaches will push to get an advantage, and actually trying to manage the overall situation from the officials' perspective as well. So when we look at the stats, this is just, I'll show you two sheets of summaries of numbers. Really just the point here is that we measured a considerable amount of data. So behind all of this, we have a foundation of numbers, so data. The bit we're trying to get to is benchmarks, patterns, and ultimately insights that can help in different ways, either to look at norms, to look at situations that we can help referees with, and even things that maybe highlight areas that we could also help coach education with, because they all feed into this one thing, the performance that we want on game day. So total events, I'll say we got nearly 23,000 events that were tagged in the 2021 season. The breakdown by type, so the majority were behaviors, because each referee in game event also had a behavior, but the referee also displayed behavior throughout the game and in between gameplay and stoppages, etc. So pushed right through. And then we just did a reference point of total whistle blows. Now I'll come to that a little bit later, because it's important in terms of, because the whistle is probably the most obvious symbol of the ref or referee at a game, at any type of sports game, and the sound of the whistle is synonymous with, okay, this is to grab attention in some way, or to make a point. So I'll reference that a little bit later as we go through. As we stepped into the second season, We had an even break between league and championship. Previous year we had more dominance around championship. Again, the number of events were quite similar, and also the breakdown type between events and behaviours were similar as well in terms of just quantity as well as the whistle blows. One addition that we did bring in was a subjective scoring system. So that's where we put a weighted score, like a value, beside or behind the events that were being tracked. So, for example, it wasn't to attribute any critique or over benefit to things. It was actually to look at things that we wanted to see happen more in terms of flow of the game, but also just the governance elements of the game as well. So obviously, if you've got a clear foul that warrants an intervention or a card, that was being captured or recorded in the right manner. And it meant that we could build up a score behind the events that we're tracking. So that started to lead to a performance score. So these are some of the averages we started to get through. Now, they'll not really mean anything to you because they're sort of out of context. It's just to mention that we have a value system layered behind the things we measure. And then the next evolution of that is to look at, well, what are the benchmarks for types of performance in types of games at types of levels? That's where we'd like to get to. And can we build a ranking system to help assessment and value against those as well? And to look at maybe where the gaps were, if there are any, and to actually look at the really good things that maybe can be repeated. And this can help other officials in similar situations. So again, that teaching approach. When we compare the findings between 2021 and 2022, the norms were quite consistent, and we were looking to see would there be big differences between league and championship reference the amount of events that were very similar, and indeed the overall total quantity of events were very similar as well. What we did notice is maybe in both seasons there were 2 games, just the way it worked out, that went to extra time. Now, if that imbalance hadn't been addressed but in the second season, we probably would have seen a slight increase in numbers for the number of events that were tracked, but it just happened to be with 2 sets of games that went to extra time in the championship format. In terms of the referee game events themselves, just listed below this graph are the types of events that we would attract. So these, we've a further breakdown, but this is sort of top line to give us a simpler report or visual. So, and it ranges everywhere from warm-up, advantage play, to stoppages, to the cards, to the freeze maybe missed, right through to the cool down. So from the start through to the game, to the end of the game as well. So this is distinct from the behaviors displayed by the referees, but actually it's the type of actions or interventions they may have applied. Some of the points maybe to highlight rather than go through everything is advantage played. You can see that it's quite high, which is a good thing in terms of maybe the ethos of getting a free-flowing and encouraging the game to play. Probably around this, we would like to look maybe more tactical significance of maybe where exactly the advantage is being played. You know, what's the advantage of a team breaking out of their own defence versus a team in transition to getting a shooting opportunity, or does that apply as much? So you can see the numbers are quite average for those, but they're quite high in comparison to some of the others. Stoppage is down to 14, roughly 14, 13 is an average per game. So these are per game averages. And those main reasons for that would have been things like maybe an injury or substitutions would have been the 2 most common options there. Non-technical is quite a high one compared to the other ones. So that would have been maybe over carry of the ball or something like that, where these things happened and roughly we're getting around about 39-40. Then the booking and caution, obviously that's a combination of players being ticked or possibly leading into maybe multiple ticks and maybe a caution or a booking. And then right down to freeze miss that were non-technical. So again, is it round about the 1-2 mark? So the reassuring point was that if there were incidents that required an intervention in terms of maybe a type of foul or free, it was very, very few, very, very minimal in terms of the overall base. That's a real positive compliment to all the referees who participated in this study. And then we could see that there is a norm around and a gradual increase in playing more advantage, and that there is an increase in maybe types of fouls, but the type of foul predominantly is the non-technical at this point, rather than maybe deliberate or card-based fouls as well. Between the 2 seasons, we saw advantage played increased by about 13%. So that's from 2021 to 2022. But what was interesting is that just over half, so 57% of the time, the team that was awarded the advantage, so the team in possession, they actually gained something from it. So nearly half the time it had to be called back. So again, maybe to explore that a bit further for our study might be an evolution to look at the tactical significance of maybe how teams were playing to combat that and see how much of advantage can be applied. And that also could relate to maybe the zones of the pitch that those instances are happening as well.
Joe, just on that point, just do you mind just maybe reiterating there, just to clarify maybe for the people, when you say that maybe that something maybe not necessarily gained, you're talking here about maybe the opposing team trying to stop that advantage. Is that what just, if you could just maybe just really hone in on that point for me, just to make it clear for people?
Yeah, so it meant that within the advantage time applied, they didn't gain any significant advantage. It was called back for the free, and it was nearly half the time that happened. Where it didn't happen, they were able to break further to gain either territory in terms of attack, and in some cases actually getting a shot off as well, or getting a score, or in that case getting a call back for a scoreable free. So it looked like, we haven't gone into that detail to quantify it, but it would suggest that even if the advantage was played, depending on where it was played, the opposition team would still curtail the advantage. So therefore, the risk to them was reduced. So that's an example where maybe they're playing a tactic, even if advantage is awarded against them. So that might be something to consider on a wider basis going forward. In terms of the breakdown, it might seem obvious, but in the year one, there was 66% of the time advantage was played in championship versus 34% of the time in league. But that was because we'd more championship type games than we had league games in that particular season. But what was interesting was that the majority of data, well, the data suggested that the majority of times that advantage would be played in that 2021 season would have been in the second half. So very few in the first half, but majority was in the second half for whatever reason. So 72% of the time would be in the second period or second half. As I mentioned, we had a more even split between league and championship. So you can see the numbers did rebalance, sort of realign. So again, that was give us reassurance that the numbers are correct. And so it was 56-44, so league versus championship. If anything, it went slightly more to league. And the game periods became more even. So there was not quite a 50-50 split, but 47% first half, 53% second half of when advantage will be played for either team. So not dominated in one period, maybe when the game was in the melting pot, for example, but actually when the game was still developing and both teams were in contest. As I mentioned, the most common example of stoppages were injury and substitution. That's maybe not that surprising, but just the parts of the game to be aware of. Also maybe highlights the governance aspect of the role of the referee, because part of it is safety. You know, it's that safe environment that allowed players to play, and the rules are there for a reason. Also maybe on the coaching responsibility side is maybe how players are coached to do things, because that could also impact injury in terms of maybe looking at the types of fouls, which is the next point. So for example, high tackle accounted for the highest foul, so a yellow type foul. So we've broken down the types of fouls by categories. So you can see 32% fell into that category in the 2021 season, and it actually has increased. So in the past year, it increased to 52%. So we can see a much higher incidence of high tackles that warrant an intervention from the referee. The next two levels below that would be persistent fouling, so 32%, and then deliberate pull or trip, 28% were also noted. And that last one in particular, it would have been occurring with the benefit, or we could capture it with the benefit of the behind the goals angle, because it would often happen with the defender against the forward before the ball had arrived in that area, in that attack. So as play was developing, it was almost, again, tactically, they were targeting certain players to neutralize either the run or the space or the opportunity for them to get in front. And this, again, is a good example, like Lizzie mentioned earlier, is having others around them. So you had a lines person maybe flagging a point. You maybe had someone, an umpire, who had identified a point as well. And that could draw a referee's attention, because it's hard to be everywhere at once in a big pitch in a game situation.
I suppose, Joe, I'm going to throw a question at you, because I think if it's not asked now, it'll certainly be asked towards the end. You made I think you said about 32% of tackles in 2021 were kind of high, you know, they were high tackles, right? And that increased to in around 50%, was it?
Yeah, 52, yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose, while maybe I think it's important for us as match officials to be aware, necessarily that, you know, that has increased, but that possibly, and I know it's very broad, it's hard to say from this, but that possibly has an implication for coaches as well. I would think, Joe, would it?
Yeah, well,
In
it's
well, in
because like
terms of, from a coaching capacity for coaches to be aware, you know.
yeah, you mean the thing is, you want players to be safe as well, because you know a referee doesn't want to be drawn in to send a player off or to intervene in maybe the most extreme manners that they may have to, because they're looking at the safety of players in either team. But it could be that that's how the players are being coached, or maybe that's how the tactics are being played. So they're pushing the line to a certain extent. So it makes sense that it should have a route into coach education as well to help, because we all want to benefit the game and want to develop and help those in the game. So that's the referee, the coach, and the player.
And I suppose at the same time, I suppose, Joe, you'll be doing a bit of work with referees again around the country next year. And it'll be interesting, I think, coming out of that as well to see, I suppose, not just from 2021 to 22, but right across, I suppose, a 3-year spread, which would maybe give us a good benchmark in terms of these as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose really you would need, say, 3 to 5 years of data to get into more confident benchmarks. And you'd like to see, if possible, if information could be used in other aspects of the game. And in a couple of years' time, could we see that reduction in that? And therefore, the reduction for the referee to intervene, and what benefit does that have to the game overall in terms of maybe the scores, the display, you know, the skills that we get to see, rather than players being maybe curtailed illegally in this instance, you know, in terms of the laws of the game. But yeah, it makes sense that they should be interlinked to help each other. Other things we found holding. So again, that would have been 25% in 2021. Again, it increased slightly last year, but again, it's sort of that sort of, I'm not going to say the dark arts, but it's that subtlety of prevention even before maybe opportunities develop, when possession transitions maybe at an early part of the game, when you maybe break out of defense even before you get up into your transition area. So these are the most consistent non-technical fouls. And you can see the over carry will come in. So over carry will always probably be part of the game, either maybe the pressure the players put under by the defender, and maybe they just chance their luck and take an extra few steps. You know, some of it can be very marginal, but it's probably not surprising that that can happen, particularly maybe in different pressurized situations in the game where there's maybe less space, and maybe even we're seeing teams playing defensive styles as well. So you can see the numbers around those. We did find it interesting that booking and cautions were more likely to happen in championship games compared to league. Again, that possibly could be linked to the significance of the game. So it is at that level, it would be very much looking at the results, and the two, it's all about getting through to the next stage. So there are things that maybe force the hand of the referee, but also the referee as maybe at a heightened a level of awareness because of the whole game situation. Because the big thing that influences everyone and every person in that situation is maybe the context and significance of the game itself. We did find as well last year, or this past season, that because there's so much going on at times and so many things to warrant and note, particularly at certain points in the game when multiple things can happen on top of each other, sometimes the wrong player could be ticked. And that was something we started to measure as well. So we found that on 4 occasions the wrong player was ticked, and 6% of cautions led to yellow cards. But you can sort of see that, you know, the difference between an 8 and a 6 in the terms of a jersey number, depending on a group, in terms of visuals. But again, having an extra pair of eyes can be really useful to help them look back at that, because, you know, a player could have been on 2 ticks and then suddenly the 3rd tick goes to someone else, just an error. But what impact could that have in the game overall for that 10-minute period if that player's sin binder off the pitch? So that's just the detail of things that can happen, because there's a lot of things. Like I remember one particular situation where, like, if you try and picture yourself as the referee in this situation where multiple things happen in seconds on top of each other, you know, and as Lizzie mentioned, you know, if you're on your own isolate, it's very hard to carry all those multiple things. So for example, if you picture the scene, players breaking through round about the 21 is deliberately dragged back, but still carries on. So that's a deliberate foul. So there's an intervention required, but so the referee plays advantage and displays that, so we can see visually the play goes on. The player then scores, so that's a point. So that's another thing. The game is then ended for the first half, and then the lines person draws the referee's attention to another point. So that referee had to deal with like 5 or 6 points, all within a count of, like, if you count in your head, 1, 2, 3, all those things happened within that very tight time frame. So it's incredibly difficult to capture everything on your own. And in that situation, the score was missed. So at halftime, that referee got all the other points, but then when that referee left the pitch, the score was wrong compared to the scoreboard, because that was the one thing that they had forgotten to mark off. So it's just important, but then they did rectify it because there's other match officials there to help. So trying to contend with everything on your own is a big challenge. As I mentioned, there's also an overlap of holding and the overcarry, because they were also the most missed frees. It just highlights the number of times that this happens in the game. So holding sometimes can be slightly innocuous. Overcarry can sometimes be disguised or hidden if you're obscured, but it is captured quite a lot, but also equally it's missed quite a lot. So it happens quite a lot in the game. There's a high frequency of those two non-technical type fouls or technical type fouls. And then as I mentioned, we did look at referees warm up. So at the very start of the game, that pre-match stage, that was part of their introduction, still in that role. So they're in their gear, they're stepping on the pitch, they're the referee, even though the game hasn't started, but they're still in role, they're still in position. So it used to be that the referees predominantly would warm up as a team. So the refereeing would work up as a team, but then that's since dropped to about 30%. In this past year, with most referees actually warming up on their own in isolation. But again, it probably would make sense if they did it as a group. So you have that team approach going in. So it's not just the referee, it's the referee and his or her team that are there to officiate and govern that game as well.
So just something that came in there from Maura. I think you touched on, I suppose, she just asked her about overlooked fouls. So you might have made reference to that. So she's just asking, for overlooked fouls, was the advantage played, or are your stats purely overlooked? Does that make sense?
Well, what we were doing is the advantage played was double counted as a foul and advantage played. We just made the different distinction that it was to the benefit of the team being fouled to allow them to continue on. But in some cases, it was called back, as remember, nearly half the time that happened, and that was what our research had shown. So if it was advantage played, it was treated number one as a foul, but also as an advantage played. But then if there was a foul, so it wasn't a foul missed, it was actually a foul seen. But then the discretion of the referee was to give it to the advantage of the team in possession.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joe.
So now moving, so that's looking at sort of broad base the events, so you can see they're game related. This one is slightly different. This is where we're starting to look at behaviors of the referee, and a big thing of refereeing that we notice is instruction. So fundamentally communication. So how do they engage? How do they put the message across? How do they show what the call is, or maybe why that's the case? So there's a couple of variables we looked at. So you can see just along the bottom, we've got hand signal, we've got verbal, we've hand signal and verbal, whistle and hand signal, whistle, hand signal, verbal, whistle and verbal, and whistle, no hand signal. So that sounds like a challenge of a rhyme. You should try and rhyme off sometimes at a Christmas party. But basically, we're trying to break down the main types of communication that were observed, seen, or expected of referees at games. And when you look at this, you know, if we are an observer of a game, so and a fan, assessor, a team official, someone on the bench, whatever it is, you know, it's important to be able to see what it is the judgment is for, or what is it. So, and fundamentally, that the players themselves can see this. So you can see, for example, two really major interventions in terms of instruction are verbal. So 32% of instruction is verbal based on the research, and that's over the 2-year period. And also 30 and 28% is what we got for whistle and no hand signal. So you can see that both of those are interventions with no visual, whereas the one that sort of combines all, so you have the whistle command, so that's attention, the hand signal, which is a display of what it is, maybe the direction, and the verbal to explain, you know, and reassure. So that would be the goal. That center bit is the gold star one we're trying to get to as a consistent way of displaying and instructing the intervention the referees put in place or chosen to apply at that point. and it's only around 14%. So compared to the other two, which are non-visual, but they're more sound orientated or auditory, it's half, roughly about half or less of what those other two are. So that's maybe something we need to focus on, and maybe over time try and redress as how we show and how we display. So you can see the big number there is roughly about 65% of referee instruction does not include a visual display. So that's basically a show using your hand, or modeling with the tug of the jersey, or the slap on the arm, whatever it may be, or the point of direction. These are all visual things that are important to be able to paint the picture. Whereas the other dominant ones are non-visual. So again, they can hear you. So there's a whistle sounded, there may be a shout, and also both of those can happen in isolation. So there might be a whistle and nothing else. There might be a verbal and nothing else. So these things, we're trying to get the balance. There's still quite a high level of just the whistle and no visual signal or visual display at all. Interestingly, we mentioned the team official a little earlier as well, and those conversations do happen. And if you're a referee, you may have found yourself in those types of situations as well. What we found is they're most likely to happen during the stoppage, 40%, or pre-match, 27%. And as I mentioned, it's the type of question the referee gets is sort of subtle to start with, at least. So referees are most likely to be asked non-technical questions by a team official. So that's 50%, 56% of the questions that a team official will ask. They're not a technical point about the game. There's something else, but they can lead into a conversation that has either nuances or a real deliberate strategy to get their point across, because it'll develop into things that we've heard might be, well, they reference a stat to say, well, how many frees one team has got versus the other. Maybe a player being fouled too many times, maybe a player something missed, or whatever it may be. So they've started in a very subtle way in some cases, and then it's broadened into something else. And as Izzy mentioned, those situations, because you're stepping out of the in-play situations, you need to have people around you just to have that reassurance and support, either to walk off, explain, or to refer back to for support as well. So you never really want to be left in isolation in any type of situation, particularly when the focus is on you in referencing the game. Whistle blows we mentioned as well. So this is usually variable, but it's the most common attribute that you may associate with the official at the game. So either seeing the whistle or the blow of the whistle or the sound of the whistle. Some will be naturally linked to key things that happen in the game, or scores, or whatever it may be, or research, that type of thing, or changes, or stoppages and plays, and then the explanation of what that is. What we found is the average number was about 155 per game in terms of whistle blows. So that's just a reference point for us. But I've picked two examples here to show that it really, what makes this relevant is the context of the game. So on the left, you can see that the most occurrences of the referee blowing the whistle was 234 times in the game. And you're thinking, God, that's an awful lot of whistle interventions in that particular game. What was different about that game was that it was longer than normal. So it was a game that had extra time. So it had broader minutes. It also had an end of normal time. So there was a period there. Then it had 2 periods of extra time, your break, and then the end of that as well. So like a game and a half. So it was a longer period. The context of that game is really what made it those types of numbers. There was 40 scores, 59 kickouts, 19 stoppages, 52 fouls, 20 advantages. So that was a game where you had two teams both having an attacking ethos. So they attacked, so lots of scores, high scoring, end-to-end type game. Whereas in comparison, the lowest recorded in the game was 105, but it had a normal time game, very little, obviously there was no extra time applied in that game. It was decided on the day, 15 scores, so it ended 1-7 to 7 points, 30 kickouts, 12 stoppages, 45 fouls, 15 advantages. But the characteristic of that game was different. When you looked at the game, because that we're trying to look at maybe what affects these things, or what forces these things, or what encourages these things to happen. The context of that game was more, you would describe more as a possession type game. And that's where both teams were trying to keep the ball, feel each other out in terms of trying to draw them in to create an overload or an extra player to get an advantage in attack. Both relied a lot on set pieces in terms of scoreable frees. So it was more of a contained game, which helps explain why the number of whistles would have been a lot less, because players were standing off, they were keeping possession in certain areas, lots of lateral play, whereas the other one was a lot of invasive play. So getting into the opposition's territory, trying to break the line, go past players, and you can see the numbers sort of back that up. So the number on its own isn't really significant. It's more the context of the game that maybe needs a different level of interventions or a different number or different types of interventions in each case. Is that okay? So we move to modeling and tone of voice. So just to explain briefly what modeling is. Modeling, I suppose, is more commonly used in coaching or teaching. It's where we show what it is we're trying to explain. So it's the picture. As I mentioned earlier, a referee might blow for a pull of a jersey or tug of a jersey and then tug his or her own jersey. And that's basically modeling. So it's the picture of what I saw you do. This is why I'm blowing this free kick. So that's where we show as a tell. And what we found is the overwhelming use of that was in foul simulation. So 97% of the time where a referee models, show to explain something. So the game has stopped and then they show what it is. So it could be a slap on the arm, it could be the tug of the jersey, it could be arms on the shoulder. These are things that we've seen the referees display. So with that, it's the picture as the tell. So 97% of the time it's foul simulation. What's interesting is that some of the referees behave a little bit like a coach in that what they do is they'll show how to do it right. And that's maybe, now it's a very small number, but in terms of this, it's only 3% because that's the balance. But if you think about it, what they're doing is they're helping in some way. Now, we talked about how we can maybe facilitate and transfer some of this information insights into coach education. But in that case, we found some referees, maybe they do coach with their teams already, I'm not sure about that. And they just maybe have that attribute to bring in. It's not their role on the day, but maybe it's something they're trying to help with. You could maybe picture how that could apply maybe more so with juvenile or youth games, where maybe the result isn't the paramount, but actually it's the process and they're helping them understand. Tone of voice of players is mainly authoritative. So that's the referee in a confident state. They know what they're about. They understand the rules of the game. They know what they saw or what they were informed with because they trust their colleagues officiating in that situation. And also there's a little bit of conversation. So that's just the nature of, that would have been displayed mainly in the pre-game period, speaking, saying good luck to players, maybe giving an expectation of what you want from the game from a referee's perspective. You want a clean for a game. Also to give them an insight as I'm looking for example, high tackles, high challenges, it won't be tolerated, or something about kickouts. You'd hear things like that in terms of conversation, just that they set the benchmark themselves of maybe key things that they're aware of in past games or in games they've had before. And that gives players an insight and prepares them, okay, we know where we stand with this particular referee for these one or two key areas, and that can maybe help the game by that foresight as well. As we mentioned, having those officials around you, that support network at any level, so club right through, is really important. What was interesting is that when referees did choose to engage and ask for another view, so another perspective of maybe a situation, 72% of the time the decision was confirmed when they conferred with a match official. So again, as we said at the start, that could be a big call. So it is quite a mature thing to not immediately react. If you're not sure, use the resources you have around you, and that's the views that maybe were obscured, just to give you that bit of confirmation. It also can buy you a little bit of time to process what it is you saw and confirm that with the others around you as well, and then you can apply the decision. So 72% tells us, okay, that's a big number in terms of confirmation, but also lets us know that the other part of the time, the other 28% of the time, they maybe changed the decision. So they were maybe applied a different view, maybe give the free out, maybe they didn't give the penalty, maybe they changed who it was they needed to speak to. And again, that's a mature thing to do in terms of looking for that support, because if they see the better view of it, then it makes sense to tap into what they saw of that situation. The tone of voice, okay, initially we looked at players, now it's looking at the match officials. So these are colleagues, these are peers. So it could be a fourth official, could be umpires, could be lines people as well. And it's predominantly conversational and authoritative. So again, they know what they're about and know the purpose. They set out how they're going to approach the game, etc., what to look for, key things. And then the conversational nature is they're helping each other, they're talking to each other. And there's also, we found, a small degree of humor, and that's maybe to be expected because it's conversational, it's relationship based, and these are peer-to-peer. And again, the humor would be mainly pre-game, so we're getting into this, and then the switch hits when we start the game. So we have a job here, we have a role, and then there may be another bit of conversational element at the very end. Game is over, concluded, and now you're stepping off the field of play. So different situations and different personas, but different people you would engage with maybe in different ways, and that's what we're trying to find, and that's what we're actually starting to see in terms of the data as well. So I have a short video clip here near the end of a couple of examples of what we talked about. So it just happens to be a county game, but the referee, you can look for different situations. I've just picked the ref cam view, so it's the pitch side view of this particular referee, and you'll see a combination. If you try and think of the things we talked about, like for example, what was the instruction like? You think of, is it whistle, verbal? Is there a hand signal? Is it a combination? Is there modeling? So is there a display to explain why? Does he respond to questions? What is his tone of voice? How do you think he talks to the players? Even positionally, where is he in relationship to where he sees something happen and then he blows it, or maybe then he intervenes? So it's just three small clips. So I'll just play this through so you can see it. Hopefully you can hear this as well.
No. Hey, no. Oh, it's a slapping. Straight slapping, okay? You were never going to make the... Yeah, okay. Okay, just pull it back. Just back to the... Yeah. Back to the line first. Okay, no, 13, 15, your knee was on the ground this time, okay? You were doing well up to that. No, 15, knee was on the ground. You were doing all right.
On the ground.
Huh?
So you can sort of see a mixture of display, but the big thing there was the consistency of the picture, whistle, verbal, and action in terms of hand signal. And he rounded it off nicely with a genuflection at the end, just to show that the knee was on the ground when she was picking up the ball, which is a technical foul as well. And how he handled situations. So he wasn't bogged down. The play was still going to continue, but he's still engaged in a manner. So he wasn't dismissive. He would listen. He would talk back, but he was keen to keep the game going as well. So they're the types of things that we mean by behaviors, but also actions. And in this case, a little bit about positioning as well.
Yeah, Joe, can I throw maybe something at the people who are on here tonight to maybe engage a little bit here? Was there anything, I suppose, from things that Joe took us through this evening that maybe you never thought before, that maybe you saw in the clip? I know it's can be blurred enough probably on Zoom to see it, but just if there was anything, observations here, maybe I'd love you to share what you've seen, or maybe was there something different or something you didn't think about before? And maybe at the same time, Joe, would you mind maybe sharing that again? Because it's really good to actually hear it and to see it at the same time, because there's some really, really good practice, I think, in these videos.
Okay, I'll hit this again. You'll also notice as well that in one of the clips, look at the role of the lines person. So that's an example of someone helping the referee. And also if the player tries to steal a few yards, it's the line person who's calling the player back in that particular case.
No. Hey, no. Oh, it's a slapping. Straight slapping, okay? You were never going to make the... Yeah, okay. Okay, just pull it back. Just back to the... Yeah. Back to the line first. Okay, no, 13, 15, your knee was on the ground this time, okay? You were doing well up to that. No, 15, knee was on the ground. You were doing all right.
On the ground.
No, should we challenge for the ball? She didn't throw you, no. Oh. All right, okay, don't worry. I'll try and keep an eye on it. Okay, he's challenging. We'll keep an eye on it.
Okay, just something came in there. If anyone might let me know, they were saying that possibly there's one person there who said they can't see anything else on screen except you, Joe. So maybe if somebody else wouldn't mind maybe just coming in just to let me know, maybe Jackie again, because I know I see you're on tonight. You can let me know whether you could see that video okay. You can see everything is going okay, just to let me know. Yeah, great. Yeah, I can see it all. So it might be just whoever's on maybe is having a little bit of difficulty in there. And thanks, Emil. Brilliant. Thanks, Austin. Super stuff. Good to know. Just as I said, if there was anything there that people felt they want to comment on or to ask us, because Joe, I find this really, really, really interesting, because I think, you know, sometimes as people who may be spectators don't see that. So just the really good practice is brilliant to see. But just kind of, I know you're coming maybe towards the back end of the presentation, but just for me, and look, in this football and all the education courses, the one thing that we're really trying to get across from literally goal games right through to adults, that is what you've already spoken about, Joe: whistle, signal, tell. So whistle when the foul happens, signal. So you're talking about model there, but signal for the foul, what way it's going, what the foul was, and actually to communicate by telling the players around there what that foul was for. And you know, we looked at the stats at that. I think it was only like 14% where referees in those games, roughly across the 2 years, both years, were doing all three. And I think if we go back and reflect on what things we can do better, I would imagine some referees would say, look, maybe I need to think about that. So I think that's really, really interesting. So that's brilliant. I'll just see if there's one or two questions after coming in there. There's one or two that we're going to hold until the end, Joe, because they're better. So I'll pass back to you. But look, thanks a million, Joe, because I think this is really, really insightful, I think, for us as referees and match officials, to see this and to see what does good look like, you know. And this, for me, there's a lot of good in those three clips together, Joe. So thanks a million for that. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, well, I suppose what we're really trying to get to is like reference points, you know, to see what good looks like or could be. But I suppose it always comes with a degree of what is the context of that particular situation. You know, what is the pressure the referees under, what support do they have, what's influencing the game outside of the referee in terms of tactics, strategies, other behaviors of other individuals as well. And I suppose on that point of behavior, we know, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the reason we looked at the behavioral aspect is because we have a lot of experience of that, mainly from a coach and education background, and we know how it applies and how it affects the response of those you're with. And if you know, those types of command and instruct behaviors can have a level of positive or negative impact, but we know also that they're controllable. So to be self-aware is a massively powerful thing. And that's where reflection comes in, to be able to look back at yourself, to see what you did, to look at others and see what they did and compare and help. That's where you have the start of these ideas of peer groups. That's just people helping people, because ultimately you want to achieve the same thing. And that's to aid and support a better game in a safe and competitive way. So even at a very basic level, or even to do it at yourself, you know, if your game is filmed, like more games are streamed these days than ever before, could you look back and look at some of yourself in that game? I know myself, because some of my colleagues are involved in streaming, and what's really interesting is sometimes it's the referees or the first people to buy an on-demand copy of the game that was streamed, because they want to look at the decisions that they gave in the game to see how it looked, or when they look back at it again. Or do you have a colleague who can maybe make notes? You know, when they watch you in the game, can you look back and compare things? Because it's hard to observe and remember without noting. Just to keep a simple record of 2 or 3 very simple things, and then that's a starting point, something to work from. It could maybe be very simply position. It could be maybe a count of how many times you do show and tell, as well as the whistles, with the combination, as opposed to maybe it's too much of one in isolation. And that's the point that Lizzie mentioned earlier, is that visual display is the most powerful means of showing something, of telling and clarity in game of what decision call is. But yeah, it's only about 35% of what instruction currently is in the coaches that were part of this study. Now, it is a broad base, granted, and this is just to give us a starting point, because we would like to develop this further and say, well, is that the norm? And if that is, what could be done to try and rebalance it a little bit more? And if we can readdress it a little bit more, what impact does that have overall in terms of the other interactions, the other behaviors, and the other things that ultimately can happen in the game? And again, as we've talked about, is how this could feed into other parts of the game. In this case, I've suggested maybe coach education, because if we can also identify the main things that require and necessitate the referee to get involved, particularly for types of fouling, maybe and dangerous elements of play, and maybe deliberate aspects of play as well, because the tactics are pushing it right to the line. What can be done to bring this back into education programs to possibly readdress it or give it a focus in some way, so that players are understanding the technique or the process better, so they know how it fits within the game, so we can maybe reduce that. Hopefully that would be the objective, to bring that through further down the line. But that's sort of the main summary points I've taken from it. As I said, it's an ongoing project, so there's still more to do. We're still learning through the process, so we probably have more questions right now than answers, but there are some interesting data points coming out that would maybe steer us to look at particular areas in a wee bit more depth as well.
Something that came in earlier, Joe, was I think you had a slide up that 72% of decisions were confirmed with other match officials. So I suppose the question that came in, I think that was being asked to me was that all decisions, or was that like what we might consider key game decisions?
No, it wasn't all decisions. It was key game decisions where they chose to go to another member of the match officials to confirm. So it sort of, what we saw was it bought a little bit of time, but also allowed them to confer with one or two others and then make a call on the back of that. So a notable example might be the awarding of a penalty or something like that.
Brilliant. Great. There was just a couple of things I'm going to go back to a little earlier on, if that's okay, Joe, with a few questions come in. So one of the first questions or earlier questions that came in was, hi, Joe, is there any stats on the stoppage time being added by referees, be it correct or not, and how accurate it is, and it being added correctly for the right conditions in play? So for head or serious injuries taken into account, it's a game with no timekeeper or stadium clock. So that's a very, very long question. So I'm not sure if you're getting what was being asked there, but
yeah, well, again, that depends. I don't have a definitive answer on that at the moment. We were lucky enough to be at certain games where there was a hooter and a stop clock, so that was catered for and taken out of our hands. But there were certainly, in certain cases, we saw injury time being added. There was 2 games we were at over the 2 years where there were serious injuries, where ambulances were actually called to the ground as well, and that led to just a massive stop or complete stop in the game in its entirety. So they were just one-off unfortunate situations, but I don't have a specific guide on the time being added for injuries.
Great, brilliant. See, I know I've had a couple of people message in just around the hand signals, and I suppose maybe it's a good time to reflect on that, because we've spoken about the visual, Joe. So look, maybe at some point that's something that I can share across with you in the coming weeks, because we do have them there. We have a lot of some of them are still images and some of them videos, so we'll try and get them out, or we might include that again. Maybe, Joe, we might invite you back maybe again in the new year in 2023 to look at a couple of specific things, and maybe looking at the importance of signaling. I suppose the one thing that really came across for me, Joe, and I think, look, I always talk about it no matter what game you're involved in, is that like communication is key. It's a very basic statement, but everything the referee is very clear to me from some of the points that I would take away from the findings so far, is that communication, it's across, whether it's talking, show and telling, before, during, after the game. And even, I think that piece, I'll go back to that piece about, that pre-game or even at halftime, being approached by mentors or players, and definitely for me, for younger referees or less experienced referees starting out, look, having a really, really good team of officials around you that, I always say that, when a halftime comes, Joe, making sure that the match officials are coming in there, meeting the referee at halftime to support them, all walking off together, is really, really important. Yeah, I suppose Niall has a good question in there. So our referee heart rate's being tracked as part of the analysis to see any effect on the decisions, especially late on in the game.
At the moment, no, but
No.
the hope is that will be added, because that's an interesting question, because obviously decision making and fatigue have a relationship between each other, And if you remember some of the games, so while I know some of the games we were at, particularly 2 years ago, we had a really warm weather spell. So we had very warm, very intense, dry temperatures. And some of the games are played really fast. So referees have to keep up with the play. So that could potentially be a consideration.
Yep. And look, just to say that it is something we actually are looking into at the minute, and all going well, it's possibly something we might try and introduce maybe in a number of games again, a number of games I should say in 2023. But yeah, definitely some it would be really, really interesting. So thanks a million, Niall, for that. Another question in there, Joe, is there a heat match showing the referee? Oh, sorry, is there a heat match showing the referee positioning on the pitch, or is that something you covered as part of the, I suppose, the analysis?
Yes, that's something that we covered as part of the analysis. So generally, the shape, trying to explain the shape, generally the shape would be like a lozenge shape, almost like an Aussie rules ball between the two goals. So roughly the main dominance of location would be running from the 21 to the 21, roughly in line with the two goalposts, but in a curve running around and then central. So a lot of central location would be for kickouts or restarts or transitional play. And I suppose in terms of percentage wise, I don't have the number right in front of me, but I think roughly round about, if you imagine the pitch, roughly round about the center of the 40 or 45 and around there was the main static position for a referee for both halves. So that would have been maybe around about 40-50% of the overall position. But that sort of makes sense because that tends to be where they set up for every kick out, for example, for both sides. And that'll happen a certain amount of times in the game. And there'll be other things that they do to keep up with plays in terms of scores, awarding frees, etc. But I can get you a stat breakdown of that, and maybe we could send it on to you after this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, it's something I think as well going forward, Joe, with I suppose what we're doing together is around maybe adding that in. Maybe there's, I suppose, little nuggets of information here, which is fantastic that we can add in. Now, I suppose I'm kind of conscious that we are kind of coming towards the end. So I would say, I would ask people before the last few questions come in, if you have anything maybe that you want to ask, to please pop it into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try and get to it as best we can. Or even generally love to maybe get a little bit of feedback on, maybe ask us to use the chat function to come back and let us know, was there anything from tonight so far that surprised you, or maybe even confirm something that you already knew. So we'd love you to just let us know before we finish up there. So I'm just going to have a quick look back in into the Q&A in the chat here. Yeah, I know, John, you're asking there, is there any stats at intercounty for how many kilometres the ref would run, for example, in 60 minutes? I suppose, John, that's not something, I suppose that was touched on, that's not something we've got into yet. And Joe, I don't think that was covered in your analysis, but it is, I think, something that possibly we are looking at in 2023 or 2024. So all of that would be really, really interesting. So again, thanks a million. That's another great question. I know I've been asked there, Joe, around the sharing of audio to fans during a game. And look, as an association, that's not something we're looking at the moment. Whether it's something that can be developed, I think, like, we'd like to get to a point, I think, Joe, where we have maybe enough of analysis, enough of video, but that's not something that we are looking at the moment. I suppose specifically what Joe, and you can touch on this, Joe, specifically, I suppose what Joe was doing with us is specifically to help the referee, I think. So maybe there will be benchmarks from that. So Joe, I don't know if you want to come in on that as well.
Yeah, and it was fundamentally our remit is to support the referees and the match officials. So it's more focused on the environment they're in and what happens, what they do and what happens to them. And with that, over time, use the data to build benchmarks to identify what's really happening. So we would use the data as the story. And we're lucky that we have video and audio to explain maybe how and why those things occur or don't. And then that means that we could look at maybe helping in other ways. Predominantly would be education, not just in terms of maybe the referee academy and other referees, but also with coach education that would help the players, because the players are affected in both cases from the influence of the coaches, the game strategies, how they're being coached, as well as the positions they may put the referee in terms of the calls they may have to make. The fan engagement side of stuff is interesting. Maybe you've seen some stuff where they have, I know the rugby lads have looked at maybe linking in so you can hear some of the audio between maybe the TMO judges and the referees themselves. But at this stage, it's very much more, it's focused on helping the coaches, because you have to appreciate with this, there is a certain level of vulnerability, because these referees have helped us in order to help other referees, you know, so it's we give them that discretion, which they deserve at this point, and it would really be up to them ultimately and the association if they wanted to take that further into a different type of use of the information.
Brilliant. Joe, just that came in twice, and it was something I noticed myself, just I suppose to kind of maybe wrap up a small bit, and that was for me, and you have it actually in your last slide there as a takeaway, the word reflection. And I think, I suppose, if there's a number of referees who are on tonight, or maybe who will watch this presentation back at some point and look and say, God, you know, maybe I need to sit back after game and actually reflect on, you know, 3 things that went well and maybe an area that didn't, or maybe reflect on one particular area. So if we look at the whistle signal tell, which for me is a big thing, that if a referee said, God, no, I'm doing all that, but after a game, you're getting someone to mark it, as you said, reflecting actually, well, did I do that? For me, that's huge. So that reflection piece, I would love more and more of our referees at all levels to really, you know, not put the whistle in the bag and go home, but actually sit back and say, reflect when they go home that evening, like what went well, or is there something I could maybe do better? So I don't know, would you mind maybe finishing up on that point around reflection as well, maybe to add to that, Joe, before we finish up for the night?
Yeah, no, I suppose ultimately that's where we're really going to in terms of direction. It is a really important part of learning to be able to look back at yourself. It's not always easy to do, but it is a skill that can be developed in practice. Like an easy means to do it would be to have video, but I appreciate not everyone may immediately have video of all the games they're in, but just some games. So if video is an obvious example, but even note-taking and having someone you trust, like either another referee, someone that you're connected to who knows something about the game, and they're basically taking the notes of things that could happen. And it might be just to look at your signal commands and your whistle, and even have a count of that and say, well, does that match maybe some of the averages that even we have from the referees we work with? So is it well below or over? Now, the context of the games will all be different, but that could be a simple starting point to experiment with and try out. And even what we had seen now is some of the referees that we've been lucky enough to revisit. So from year 1 into year 2, they're starting to, they granted have the advantage of being able to look back at videos of themselves. So they're starting to see things in themselves to the point where now they're starting to reflect in action at the game or immediately after the game. And how we know that is that we can hear the conversations they have with other match officials. So in some cases, even though the game's over, straight away, some referees are saying, oh, I should have done that. I saw that, but I should have done this. But it means they're sharing ideas and a second review and a rerun in their head almost of key things in the game that stood out for them. But they're doing it with a peer group who also watch the same game. So if you take a video and other aspects away from that completely, could you replicate that in a simple way with looking at 2 or 3 key points with another associate who's pen and paper and record a small note on key things in the game? And if you do have an opportunity to video in some way to look back at yourself, you know, it's not the game, it's you in the game that you're looking for. And that could be a really useful way to get into just that practice, that process of reflection as well.
Brilliant, Joe. Thanks a million. So I suppose just to finish up, I think we got to nearly all of the questions there tonight that were touched on numerous times, same theme. So look, Joe, thank you very, very much. You're doing absolutely tremendous work with us, and we really, really appreciate it. And we're looking forward to maybe what next year brings in terms of giving us even more information. So looking forward to working with you again. And I suppose finally to yourselves tonight, for those who came on, and I hope you took something from it. I think there's a little bit of food for thought there for all of us. I think anytime you come on something like this as a match official, as a referee, or even if you're not as a coach or any webinar, you're going to turn around and say, God, I need to, I've thought about that, or that's one thing that I've left a little nugget or something to think about. So look, thank you very much, everybody. And we'll be on again in the next couple of weeks again with a couple of other webinars. I'll be back on with you, yourselves, the referees, for anyone who's interested in coming back in. So for now, thank you very much, everybody. Take care. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Lizzie.